Good afternoon. It is my extraordinary pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu. Since 2005, Professor Ihsanoglu has been the Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. His association with the OIC dates back to 1980, when he was the founding Director General of the Research Center for Islamic History, Culture, and Arts in Istanbul. Professor Ihsanoglu has pioneered efforts to create greater awareness about Islamic culture across the world through research, publications, the organizing of congresses in various fields, including history of art, science, and intercultural relations. He has also initiated and supervised programs for the protection and promotion of the written and the architectural heritage of Islamic civilization in various countries around the world. He's also contributed to scholarly debates on intercultural dialogue. Professor Dr. Asano Liu was born in Cairo, Egypt. He received his BS at Ain Shams University and his master's degree in chemistry. After completing his PhD studies at Ankara University, he did his postdoctoral research at the University of Exeter in the UK. He has served as a faculty member in the Faculty of Sciences and then became the first professor and founding head of the Department of the History of Science at Istanbul University. He's also the founding chairman of the Turkish Society for the History of Science. He further served as the president of the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and is a member of various international societies, scientific councils, advisory boards, numerous academies, centers, and institutes, and editorial boards around the world. Professor Ihsanoglu is also very much involved, I'm happy to say, with Columbia University. We're proud that Columbia University Press in 2010 published one of his many books, and in fact the title of the book is the title of today's talk, The Islamic World in the New Century. In addition, Professor Ihsanoglu is one of the founding members of the advisory board of the Columbia University Global Center in Istanbul, to which he has devoted an enormous amount of time and shared his expertise with us as we attempt to build the kinds of creative, cultural, and intellectual relationships that represent so much the ethos and the spirit of Professor Ihsanoglu's career. It is my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Professor Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished scholars, students, colleagues, and the distinguished audience of this wonderful academic evening. It's really great to be back to academia after the long hustle in diplomatic affairs and the corridors of the United Nations. And I'm grateful to the host, to the University of Columbia, and to organizer, the Istanbul branch, the outreach in Istanbul, and its very active director, Mrs. İpek Cem Taha, and her colleagues, and to our host today here, and I thank him for the wonderful words, kind words he mentioned. Islamic World in the New Century, it's not only the title of my book, which has published by the Columbia University Press 2 years back, but it's a very interesting issue for all of us as we all go through difficult times. Difficult times, particularly for the last 2 weeks or 10 days, we have been witnessing this tense relation between Muslim world or parts of the Muslim world and the parts of the Western world. Extremists on the two sides are giving us a difficult time. It's interesting to see how the Muslim world will take its place in the new order to be shaped as the balance between powers has been changing since the demise of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the downfall of Berlin Wall, and the awakening of nations all over the world. It's also interesting for us all belonging to different parts of the East and West and becoming here under this roof of very distinguished academic institution, Columbia University, with many chairs for Islamic studies, Turkish studies, Arab studies, international studies, to know better about the dynamics of the Muslim world today. The mentioned book has been published a few months before what happened in the Arab world, before Bouazizi set himself to fire and the whole story started to unfold from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Yemen to Bahrain to Syria, and still unfortunately did not end. In foreseeing, the subject of the book was not really it was not a reference book in OIC, how it came to being, which were the historical background since the fall of the Caliphate and attempts of Muslim leaders, intellectuals, and political movements to establish a kind of inter-Islamic organization. It was not only that, or not only studying the rivalry between the so-called progressive camp in the Arab world and the backward camp in the Arab world, or by the socialist, nationalist, and monarchist as it was explained or understood in those days. It was also an attempt to see how OIC came as an organization stands for South-South, as an organization which represent aspirations and the hope for 1.5 billion people. In that book I said that the Muslim world aspires to regain its long lost status and strives to be a part of mainstream global community, tackling contemporary concerns and working towards development in all fields. Moreover, it yearns to benefit from the universal values of freedom, liberty, good governance, justice, and human rights, and hopes to rejoice in the blessing of progress and prosperity. That was the words I mentioned before, what has been known wrongly in my understanding as an Arab Spring. I better call it Arab awakening, or awakening of the Muslim world as a part of the international awakening. Or I would, if we need to make an Arab adjective to it, we have to say it is Arab autumn. It's the fall of dictators, but it's not the spring yet. Spring has to come after long winter and autumn and winter. Then the spring will come as the realization of democratic process, formulation of political power, political parties, establishment of constitutional system, etc., etc. So this is what I had foreseen just before the things happened. And I would like to say that OIC, in its history and for its future, will stand in the eyes of many as a symbol of unity, as a framework representing centuries-old concept of Ummah, Islamic Ummah, the worldwide community of Muslims forged through bonds of faith. Although this outlook is manifested differently throughout the Muslim world, a common spirit stemming from a long shared history and traditions deeply rooted in the common faith supports this understanding. People's expectation from the OIC generally rise to peak during periods when their own countries or Muslims in general face problems. And I think we are facing one problem today. So in reality, the OIC came into being as a South-South relationship. When we look to late 60s and early 70s, when there were tumultuous political and ideological changes that set the scene for OIC's evolution over the decades, the development efforts of the relatively new states, because in 60s and 70s you have relatively new independent states. These new states tried to be part of a bargain between the North and the South. The Muslim countries were all part of the South, and what became known as a developing world, and most still are, they strove for equal opportunities with the North in the world business and struggled to achieve economic growth and industrialization. In this effort, they increasingly sought ways to cooperate among themselves in order to increase mutual trade and investment, and to solve common problems through bilateral and multilateral arrangements. Ideas and actions were deployed by developing countries around the theme of economic cooperation for development. More recently, the expansion of global economy from the 1990s, involving the entry of very many more people into the world market and trade, has had and continues to have tangible effects on the Muslim countries. These trends have engendered a strong awareness among Muslim countries in the 21st century of their populations. Greater needs and expectation for economic growth and prosperity. This requires the removal of obstacles in the way of social mobility and advancement, the achievement of sustainable development and democratization of political system. The founding goals now have found new formulations in the term and context of the 21st century. These perhaps were the background of how OIC came into being, apart from the classic narration of 1969 and the burning of Al-Aqsa Mosque. For sure they were the reason, or that was the reason, but behind that there were very deep-rooted economic, social and political demands of these nations. Having said that on how the OIC came into being, let me say, at least from my own experience as a Secretary General, and before that as a DG of one of OIC institutions, tell you about how member countries, what they expect from OIC. The expectation of the member states of OIC differ from one country to another and are shaped primarily by two considerations, among us a wider landscape of complex determinants. This wider context includes the motives that led to the establishment of OIC, which I detailed this in different chapters of the book. It also includes obligation to meet people's needs and aspirations, as already I have elaborated. But there are two considerations which I would like to underline here. First consideration, OIC creates the possibility of obtaining political support and cooperation from the Muslim world on the basis of the very notion of the raison d'etre of OIC, what we call Islamic solidarity. This is especially the case in situations where eliciting support and cooperation can be challenging within the framework of other intergovernmental organizations, such as the United Nations. Owing to the delicate international political power, balances in which the United Nations operates cannot allow the support certain countries are looking for. I given examples through the book shows that this demand for political support has been met very successfully in some cases, while in others it has remained as an expression of moral support. In both cases, the governments of member states would present the success obtained to the OIC to their populations as an important achievement. And you can find this in reporting after meetings, ministerial meetings, summit meetings, when the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the head of state or head of the government attends and comes back to his country declaring that he has got a great support from OIC to his or her own problem, which you never get that support from other international organizations. The second consideration in what shapes the primary considerations for the member countries, the second one is economic. I already explained part of that in the relation between North, South, South, South. Here, the majority of OIC countries are non-industrial countries. 22 of them are least developed countries. These governments have invested hopes in the economic programs of OIC and its affiliated institutions, particularly the Islamic Development Bank, which is one of the most successful development banks in the world and has great programs for helping building infrastructure, social and economic development programs in OIC countries. It has been successful doing that, and since 2005, since I became Secretary, and then we adopted the 10-year program of action, there are certain special programs for Africa, for poverty alleviation funds and other funds which benefiting these countries. So this is the second consideration. For many, the greatest expectation placed in the OIC is that it will act as a forum to address common concerns as well as a platform for action. As will be outlined, it has been outlined in different chapters of the book, the OIC agenda expanded from the early stage onward and increasingly enforced the concept of all-compassing cooperation. By the end of the first decade of activities, this understanding came to be expressed in the term joint Islamic action. Though decisions are generally taken by consensus and shaped by positions adopted by politically and economically influential member states, it is worth noting here that also by consensus, the OIC has been able to develop effective policies on some issues to which public opinion in Muslim countries is most sensitive, and that these decisions have been influenced national politics. For instance, one of the issues that interest the public opinion in the Muslim countries, the Islamophobic movements. And now we're going through a very difficult, sensitive time nowadays after this nasty, obnoxious film made by obscure, misguided people, and nobody knew about them until they put it in the internet, and nobody noticed that until some other guided people on other side of the world discovered this and made an issue of it and started to agitate people to make demonstrations, to put on fire embassies, and unfortunately to kill people and to kill themselves. We in OIC, of course, condemned all these, and we have invited people to constrain, to self-constrain, and to be calm, and try to calm down the streets. And we published many statements. I also published a joint statement with the High Representative of the European Union, Cathy Ashton, and Secretary of Arab League and African Union, calling people to calm down and not to take the law in their hands, and condemning both events. Here, OIC's role comes in the fore, and we have been working on this with the European Union, with the United States, since President Bush administration and through President Obama's administration, until we reached a joint resolution in Human Rights Council in 2011, a well-known resolution by 1618, and we hope to build on this and further develop this understanding of fighting extremism on both sides, and forming a mechanism for addressing these issues. So this is the role which OIC is trying to do. I just want to give you one example before I touch on other issues relevant to OIC and the Muslim world in the 21st century. One example, good example, of how the proactive approach of OIC affected the relationship between member countries. In 2005, there was an extraordinary summit in December in the holy city of Mecca, and it was an invitation of the monarch of Saudi Arabia, the King Abdullah, for an extraordinary summit. And there we presented a 10-year program of action. This was the first time in the history of OIC such program. Among many projects and programs, we have targeted increasing the inter-trade between OIC countries. Let me tell you that inter-trade in 2004, just before the summit, was around $2,005 billion. Intra-trade, value of total intra-OIC trade was $205 billion. Last year, 2011, the value of total intra-OIC trade has reached 680. So in 7 years, it went more than 3 times. That shows to some extent these projects and programs are effective. Now, if we look to today's Muslim world, the Muslim world today, at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, is going through an awakening period. Until recently, most of the people in this part of the world were neither politically conscious nor politically active. They were either passive politically or repressed. And this was the case in many countries. The awakening happened after the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet system, the fall down of Berlin Wall. Awakening started in Central Europe, East Europe, and other parts of the world. Was late to come to the Arab world and the Muslim world. And don't forget, it did not start with Tunisia. When my book was in the printing house, what happened in Kyrgyzstan, as we call it in Turkish, or Kyrgyzia it is called in Russian and other languages. This happened in summer 2010, first time in Central Asia. People, awakened people, politically, they took to the street and they forced the dictator, a Soviet-style dictator, to abandon the country and to fled to Belarus or wherever he went. And within a very short period, which we helped them as OIC, they transformed to a constitutional system, multi-party system, and they had the first elected parliament and first elected president. That was mid 2010. In December 2010, you know the famous story of vegetable vendor poor Abu Azizi in a small town in Tunisia, and then the whole awakening of the Arab world started with this poor man putting himself to fire in protest to the sad or the bad, cruel treatment he received from the municipality, and people started to walk the streets, and then the regime has collapsed in a very short period. Then events in Egypt happened, and events in Egypt would have not happened without Tunisia doing that. So the chain reaction started rather late in the Muslim world, from Kyrgyzia to Tunisia. Tunisia happened on its own. Egypt would have not happened in its own without Tunisia happening. I will not forget an Egyptian lady talking to one of those satellite channels, saying that if they did it in Tunisia, here in Egypt, Dunya, we have to do it. So that is the chain reaction started. So this awakening now brings with it a host of issues. This awakening, first of all, we have to understand that it was a cumulative product of an internationally interdependent world connected by instant visual communication and demographically pushed by youth dynamism. You have three factors who fused in one: the national resentment, political awakening, and ideological formation. In the new ideological formation where Islam plays a role, we have to look carefully to the position of Islam in the new polity. At the end of the first decade of the 21st century, a consensus is far from being reached, and controversy still persists over the position and weight of religion as a frame of reference in the internal and external affairs of the Muslim countries. The place and effect of Islam in Muslim societies and the way the faith is reflected in their relations with the wider international community depend upon where and how each country draws the line between religion and politics. Muslims are not alone in debating this point, particularly as the role of faith in contemporary society becomes one of the pressing issues of our time. However, it is worth noting that Islam as a religion has a different place in the workings of society compared to other religions. And if we don't understand this difference, we will be in trouble. And that makes some things not more simple, it makes things more difficult. We have to understand. Islam occupied a distinct place in the polity from its advent until the abolition of caliphate in 1924. And in failure to understand and acknowledge this has often resulted in misleading interpretations and theories about the Muslim world and lead to a superficial understanding of Islam, disregarding its real cultural and religious aspects. The danger is that these analyses have influenced politicians and intellectuals both outside and inside Muslim countries. Muslim countries have experienced a diverse scale of polities, and the ideological landscape reflects that experience. At one end of the spectrum, some Islamic or Islamist regimes have embraced the strictest possible interpretation and practices of Islam. At the other end, some secularist regimes have denied Islam any role in governance. A third middle path has been adopted by other Muslim countries with variations. Among them are countries whose constitution contains a clause declaring Islam as a major source of legislation. In all these three groups, many countries constitutions adopt the principle of patria, or belonging to the same homeland, as the umbrella that covers all citizens without distinction as to race or religion. In opposition to all these trends, there are radical political movements which use Islam to justify their repugnant and illegitimate practices. One of the main accusations labeled against Islam on the international scene is based on unjustified and unfounded linking of practices of these illegal radical political movements with Islam. I have written this just before events happened. Now, after what happened in the Middle East, the relationship between Islam and politics is becoming rather a subject of bigger discussion. And the future of the Muslim world depends to a large extent on the articulation and development of the principles of good governance, together with the establishment of a tradition of pluralistic democratic practices. To be sure, there is no easy undertaking to do this. It entails unflinching perseverance, as it is likely to span more than a generation. What happened in the Arab world, what has been called as spring, is a misleading notion, because if you're celebrating the arrival of spring, then you're expected to see the blossoming of flowers, and at the end of the day you will get the fruits. But here it is not the case. As I said, this is the downfall of dictators. This is the autumn of despots. So the process democratization, the way to get the Arab Spring or the spring in the Muslim world, is likely to span more than a generation. In their recent history, many Muslim countries have not at all experienced democracy in the modern sense of this word. Similarly, those Muslim countries that have lived through some form of democratic governance have suffered setbacks and confronted crises that have simply cut short the democratic experiences. This happened before 1950. Yet Islamic heritage and history are full of memorable instances of good governance, and that the immutable principles that uphold it. We heartily believe that there is no fundamental dissonance between the application of pluralistic democracy and the foundation of good governance in Islam. Looking back to the middle of the last of the 19th century, the last century of the Ottoman Empire, we see clearly that it embraced a modern constitution and founded a parliament along with other institutions that are the hallmarks of a modern state. During this period, prominent Muslim scholars and leaders saw no conflict or disparity between these modern institutions on the one hand and the traditions of Islam and its fundamental principles of governance on the other. Better still, a significant number of those scholars and eminent Muslim figures actually contributed and participated in building of the foundation of modern institutions. And that was during the last decades of the Ottoman Sultanate, Ottoman Caliphate, Ottoman Empire, whatever you called it. Considering that the road to democracy was never paved with roses in those countries with long-standing traditions of democracy, of democratic governance, we admit that democratization, as stated above, cannot be achieved without establishing two critical principles. The first principle is good governance and transparency at the level of public affairs management and the implementation of accountability. The second is the need to allow political freedoms to be ingrained in the well-established rules of human rights. Without these two vital principles, the sole outlet of the politically active in the Muslim societies will be to seek to achieve their ambitions by falling back into the religious sphere. This scenario, if it unfolds, will eventually complicate matters and make them worse than they are already. In order for the Muslim societies to move resolutely down the path of progress, they need to define the relationship between the religious and the political, without letting one intrude onto the other. The relationship should be based on mutual respect, allowing and accepting pluralism, and also allowing change and transition in political power through democratic means. Muslim societies ought to lift the control exercised by the religious over the political and vice versa. They need to clearly determine the demarcation line between the two. I would like to say that in OIC, the 10-year program of action and the new charter, which has been accepted in 2008, the core universal values of democracy, good governance, human rights, the women's rights, empowerment of women's society, caring for child rights, development, R&D, research and development, encouraging science and technology, all these values have been advocated. And we think that OIC, as an agent of moderation and modernization within the OIC countries, the Muslim world, as an agent of moderation and modernization, and internationally as a global actor for constructive cooperation, would, as a responsible partner, would be a catalyst for development, would be a catalyst for creating a better understanding between the Muslim world and the rest, would be an agent, as I said, for modernization and moderation within the Muslim world. And hopefully, if the leadership or the developing leadership now in certain countries accept this new ethos of OIC, I hope that our future will be much better than our history. I thank you for your patience, and I didn't want to carry on. I think I am just about the time allocated to me, and I would appreciate if you have any interest in raising certain questions.
Thank you so much. We don't have that long for questions, but I would ask that you be absolutely and totally brief so that we can get as many questions in as possible. There are microphones on each side. We're going to take 2 questions at a time. State your name and the division to which you are linked. This side.
Hi, I'm Lotus. I'm in the School of General Studies. My question has to do with the clash of ideologies between the West and the Middle East. One of them you touched on a little bit is democracy, and how I've gathered that it's in certain instances Iraq, Afghanistan is being forced on the countries. I'm not completely convinced that democracy is what everyone or most of the people want in the Middle East, but that's just an example of the clash. I guess the question part of that is how do we reduce this clash? And obviously there's examples: dialogue, interaction, humanism, and obviously we need more than one of these. But what do you think is the most effective, and what do you think? How do you think we should prioritize this reduction of clashing?
Great.
And where should the resources go?
Thank you. Other question. Number 2. We're going to take 2 at a time.
All right.
Your name?
I'm Kevin Vo from Columbia College.
Great.
And my question is, there currently exists an unfortunately negative view of the Islamic world in many parts of the globe right now, and that view is vastly incorrect based on limited knowledge. And my question to you is, on an individual level, on a communal level, and on an international level, what can people do to change and create a more accurate image of the Muslim world today?
Thank you. So the first question is really the issue of whether there really is a clash between the cultures of the West and Islamic cultures. And if there is, how do we overcome the tensions that exist now in various parts of the Islamic world?
Well, I really don't think there is a clash between Islam and the West. Not on any reason, but first of all, we have to analyze what Islam stands for and West stems its roots of civilization. I think we have 2 common roots. We have to emphasize these common roots. And then we have a shared history. The common roots, if Christianity is the basis of the most Western world, we share with the Christianity the Abrahamic tradition. And you don't find these values between, say, the West and the Far East, or between Islam and the Far East. So we have shared value in Abrahamic tradition, belonging to the same divine source, if you believe in it as a believer, but if you don't believe in it as a believer, you have to take it as historical reality. The second one, which is not too much, it's very simple fact of history, but it's not too much discussed. The Greek philosophy and the ancient sciences. It was the Muslim world who inherited Greek philosophy and science and developed it. And then this went from Muslim world, through Andalusia, Sicilia, and other parts. The Arabic translation of Greek sources was translated from Arabic to Latin. And you cannot understand Thomas Aquinas without understanding Averroes. You cannot understand Newton or Copernicus without understanding Ibn Shatir or Qutbuddin Shirazi. You cannot understand Harvey without understanding Avicenna. So what is known as scientific revolution, the basis of modern culture and modern Western society, is based on Islamic sciences and philosophy, which it also took its sources, as it took from many other sources, because Islamic science and philosophy, or Islamic civilization, took root from Greek, Hellenistic, from Persian, from Indian, and from Chinese ancient civilizations, and then assembled this, and this went to the West and translated, and it was these books, after being translated to Latin, they were part and parcel of the curricula in the European universities. And without the Averroes school in Padua, there would have not been a Christian theology. So these two roots, Abrahamic root and what I call, or we can call, Greek root. Then the interchange between Islam and the European civilization through the Mediterranean, through translations. So we have so many in common. The problem we have today is twofold. One is political, and I'm sure you know that. And the second is that we are both suffering from extremists on two sides, radicals. So it is not radical, it is not a clash of civilization, it is not a clash of religions, it is not a clash of faith or culture or whatever, it is a clash of ignorant people, it is a clash of radical people on two sides, and we as a mainstream people, we as a millions and billions of people, we should not be the captives, or we should not be the victims of these radical people.
And I think that follows up very much to the second question then. Given the pervasive negative views of Islam, and you'd find that as you move around the United States, that there are frequently very extreme positions. How do we overcome that level of ignorance, both on the individual, the communitarian, and the international level?
Well, let me tell you that it looks that these small groups on both sides, I think I would put those who made this obscure film on the same grade or the same level of those who went to burn the embassy or kill the ambassador. Both are terrorists. One is abusing the right of expression, the freedom of putting releases on the internet to incite to hatred, knowing that whatever he's doing is going to provoke these ignorant people on the other side of the sea or the ocean. And then those people who immediately said, this is Americans, let go and kill the ambassador or burn the flag. I put these two people, but here we are in Columbia University. If you go to the publication house, you'll find hundreds of books written on the contribution of Muslims to the world civilization. I'm sure in different departments of history, philosophy, of religion, you're all studying this. And if you can go to the internet, you'll find hundreds of sources, thousands of them. But the problem that this vocal small group, the damage they make, they can destroy whatever we have been doing for decades. We in the OIC in 1999 initiated the Dialogue of Civilizations in the United Nations. And then 7 years ago, Turkey and Spain jointly they created what has been called Alliance of Civilizations. We have been working on similar programs, And we have reached these consensual resolutions with the United States, with the European Union, with the rest of the world, and we had a lot of work doing in all diplomatic fora, and then all of a sudden, obscure man or group comes and makes this film, and then they put the whole world on fire. So we really have to unite against these mad people. And you young people here in your dissertations, in your works, in your papers, you have also to address the masses. It's not in ivory tower that we sit and discuss these issues. We have to address the masses, and media here, mass media has the biggest responsibility to address people. This is, unfortunately, is not happening on wide scale. On the contrary, they will give long hours for these bad deeds, and they will not give short time or short hours for the good work you are doing or we are trying to do.
This is all we can deal with, the people who are up here already. Your question, please.
Hello, I'm Bessiana Vathi. I'm in Columbia College. And my question is, how long do you think it will take the government of countries like Egypt and Syria to stabilize and be on the right democratic path? And what else do the countries need to do in order for this to happen?
To help them.
Great. And
hello, my name is Arman Şener. I am a Turkish first-year student studying in Columbia Engineering School. My question is about a relatively less mainstream topic. We're always talking about Islam, the Muslim world and Western countries' relations, but there are also conflicts inside the Islamic world between Shias and Sunnis. And the public has forgotten the inner conflict of Islam while we're talking about the developments in the Arab world. What do you think about the inner conflicts, inner political conflicts of Islam, and how does OIC work to solve this conflict? Because without solving this problem, it is hard to integrate with Western civilizations, in my opinion. Thank you.
The first question, how do we remedy the dilemmas in Egypt and Syria in terms of moving towards stability and democracy?
I'm not in a position to remedy it, but I got the question. How long it will take?
I know.
Well, I think in passing I said, well, look, let's be frank. How many years democracy has took in this country to be established, or any other country? How many generations it took democracy? I wouldn't give you an American example or European. I give you an example of my country. We have been since Tanzimat. It's more than 170 years now in my country, trying to change from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, from old-fashioned institutions, state institutions, to modern institutions. And then I spoke about the first Ottoman Assembly, which was established in 1876, and the second one in 1908. And then you have constitution, first constitution, second constitution, and then you have republic, and then you have dictatorial regime under the republic, and then you have multi-party system, and we had coup d'etats, 2 military or 4 military coup d'etats, it depends on your definition. And then we have hanged our prime minister, our speaker of parliament, one of the brilliant ministers of foreign affairs, just because they were democrats, and they were not liked by the junta. So if a country, my country, went through all this, our prime minister, the current prime minister, was put in jail because he read a poetry written by a poet, patriotic poet, and it was a school books. It was nothing by communist or fascist or whatever it is. It's well-known poetry where all kids in the school. So if all this experience tells us that the road to to democracy is not paved with roses. It will take, don't think that one election in any country. Egypt is experienced election, free and fair election, first time after 60 years. 60 years with no election. There were elections, 99.999%. These were the elections, all the 60 years. Then they became rational and said, well, it's aib to make it 100%, almost make it 80% or 75%, and they will do it in the office. Now, first time. This is a long way of trial and failure, but of course the process has started. Nobody can reverse this process. So this is not spring yet. This is a downfall. This is the autumn of despots, of dictators, and the kindergarten of democracy. The second question. This is a very important issue. I have addressed this and I give some examples about this in my book. Now, the existence of different mazhab, let's use the terminology, the proper terminology, mazhab, schools of thought or juridical school or doctrines, whatever you call it in English, sects. Mazhab, the difference is there from almost the 1st century of Hijrah, of Islamic era. And this has been all through the Islamic history. The problem is not between the mazhabs themselves. Of course, there have been religious discussions, books, opinions and refutations and rivalries between mazhabs, etc. But this has been mainly academic debates, and they're all built on argumentation, disputation, quoting these verses from the Holy Quran or from the tradition of the Prophet, that he was praying this way or putting his hand this way, or that this is... Anyhow, that was the case. In the whole history of Islam, there are only few times where the political aspect was detrimental in creating rivalry between mazhabs. It was not mazhabs who created rivalry between politicals. And one of them in our own history between the Ottomans and Safavids. Now, when you look to the reality in the Middle East of today, in my generation, we never thought of an Iraqi man whose name is Ahmed or Mohammed, that he is Shi'i or Sunni or anything else. We never thought even of a Kurd or Arab. But after what happened in Iraq in the last decade, and the establishment of a sectarian system in Iraq, a sectarian polity regime, and quota for Shi'is, for Sunnis, Arabs, Kurds, etc. The whole notion has changed. Now, the war in Iraq, during the war in 2006, we in the OIC, in 2005, in Mecca summit, we have introduced a provision which has been unanimously accepted, equating 8 mazhabs. 4 Sunni mazhabs, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and 2 Shi'i mazhabs, Jafari and Zaydi, and 2 other small mazhabs, Ibadi and Zahiri. And by the decision of the summit, and this is, you can call this Ijma' Ummat, if you like, they were equated. Now, that was December 2005. In October 2006, we in the OIC managed to bring 15 of the Grand Ulama of the Sunnis and 15 of the Ayatollahs and Ayatollah Uzmas and their representatives of Shi'is together under the umbrella of OIC and made them, after long negotiations, sign a document of 10 items. And that was the first time in their modern history such a thing has happened. And that stopped the killing and the fighting between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq. So OIC has managed to do this. Because we have differentiated, we took the political aspect outside, and we concentrated on the religious aspect. And since the two are getting their sources from the book and the tradition of the Prophet, it finishes. Well, there is no place for fighting. Fighting is there because there is political parties, political powers, would like to this use group against this one, and they start fighting each other. And unfortunately, this is what now unfolds in Syria. The Syrian people, when they took to the street, they were mixed. And when it started on the government side, they were mixed, and on the opposition side, they were mixed. And I think they are still mixed. They still represent the whole spectrum of Sunnis, Shiis, Alawis, Christians, Armenians, Turkmens, Kurds. But this fight will make this differentiation, unfortunately, and this is what we are all against.
I apologize, but we are already 10 minutes over, and I really do. You've been waiting, and I wish we could continue. But please feel free to join His Excellency and the rest of you at a reception that will be held right behind me in the faculty room, where you can hopefully have a chance to ask your questions. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Your Excellency, for a wonderful presentation.